right, well, thanks for believing with me. I've never done that, but I'm glad that I did. It is in the Bible. It does say it's what we're supposed to do, and if you are sick, you can definitely call, because some days you need a little help. Some days that's what the body is for, to come together and to strengthen each other and to pray for each other and to believe with each other, because sometimes we get weak. My kids and I were listening to Exodus the other day, and it's the story where Josh was fighting I don't remember the name of the group, and God told Moses, as long as you hold your staff up, you're going to win. And whenever he put his staff down, the other army was winning. So Aaron and one of the other priests, I can't remember, came and held Moses' hands up. And that's what the body of Christ, we can do that for each other. When you're feeling weak, you should call somebody and say, I'm feeling weak, help me. You don't have to go at this alone. There's no shame in calling and saying, hey, I need the help. I mean, that's what James tells us to do. James says call and pray, pray, have people lay hands on you and anoint you. Anyways, flip over with me to Mark chapter 6. That's where we were looking at last week. I'm going to do a little recap, Mark chapter 6, and then kind of try to get through this quickly so we can get on to the new stuff. Mark chapter 6, verse 30. No, go on. We'll go on. So give a little background. The disciples and Jesus kind of go off by themselves. They're going off to pray. John the Baptist has just been killed. They go off for some alone time. And a multitude is going to come and follow Jesus. And it's said that when he sees them, he's going to be moved with compassion. And I love this. I'm going to say this every time. Because he saw that they were like sheep without a shepherd. He was moved with compassion. And I think sometimes we forget that. We go through our day and things happen and we're struggling, and we forget to stop and look at the suffering around us and to be moved with compassion for what God's doing. Because God's always at work. There's always things he's ready to do. And the best thing to do, this is the first thing I talked about in May when I first started coming up here, is responding in the opposite spirit, getting vengeance on the enemy. And when you're struggling, the best thing you can do is be moved with compassion for someone else and to give to someone else. And so that's what Jesus does. He's going to start teaching them. And then in verse 35, it says, now when the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, this is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. But he answered and said to them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 100 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? 200 denarii. We learned the other day in my kids' Bible study group, that was like 3 months worth of wages. So that's like 6 months worth of wages, which, in case you ever wonder, if people ever tell you Jesus was poor, they had at least 6 months worth of wages there to be able to go buy bread. So they come and they tell Jesus, we got a problem. It's late. The day's over. People are starting to get hungry. We need to send them away. And Jesus says, all right, fine, you take care of it. And they're like, what do you want us to take this money and go buy bread? And he says, you give them something to eat. So then he said, look at verse 38. He said, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And they found out and they said, 5 and 2 fish. And this should be a very familiar story for you. If you grew up in Sunday school at all, you know the story of the loaves and the fish. Keep going. And then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks in hundreds and in 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. And in now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. So we've had this miracle. They come, they say everybody's hungry. We got 5,000 men. That's not counting the women and children. So all these people are here. Jesus takes these loaves and fish and he miraculously multiplies them. What is a small little lunch becomes food to feed thousands. And point out at the end, they gather baskets because God is more than enough. Quote Kenneth Copeland, God is too much fish. He's just too much. He can't do anything in small amounts. When God does something, he does it until, whatever stops God is our ability to receive. And I imagine they gathered all the baskets that they had, and that's where they had to stop. Because God is always willing to give and give and give. It's only when we're like, all right, that's enough. That's enough, God. I can't take any more, that he stops. He is too much. And whatever you're doing. So it says then, immediately, this is verse 45, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethesda, when he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. So if you look at another version, it said he made them, he constrained them, he urged them. They didn't want to go to the other side. And he told them, get in the boat, we're going to the other side. And he goes off, as he often did. We pointed this out. Jesus went off a lot by himself to pray. And if Jesus needs to pray, then we definitely need to pray. So he goes off, and it says, when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and would have passed them by. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, and cried out. For they all saw him and were troubled. But immediately he talked with them and said to them, be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid. And then he went up to the boat to them, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure, and they marveled. For they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. And this is what we started talking about last week, is it said that they did not understand. I think I read you a different version, and it said they did not consider. This is the, which version said it? The NASB said they didn't gain any insight. The Amplified said they didn't understand. I think the New King James might say they didn't consider. The Good News said Good News translation said they didn't understand what had just happened because their hearts had been hardened. And I pointed out the issue about them not wanting to go across the sea, to point out that Jesus, these are not people that these are people that are following Jesus. They're his disciples. They've left everything. They are going after him. They're seeking him. We're not talking about people in, brazen sin at the moment who have turned their backs on Jesus. In fact, he has just commanded them to go across the sea when likely they understood a storm was coming and they shouldn't. And he says to them, let's go. Because he's got a purpose for them to be in the middle of this storm as he's coming. And it said, but they were so amazed. What were they amazed about? They were amazed that the wind stopped. They were amazed that he spoke to the storm. And so because they didn't understand what had just happened. They didn't consider what had happened, that miracle of the loaves and the fish, and that their hearts were hard. And this is not a person whose heart has ignored the Lord. These are people who just followed him, who went into the wilderness. They'd actually just been sent out to witness. He had sent out the 12, had sent out the 70. They had just done that. So these are people who are following Jesus, but their hearts were hard. And I read you last week that the definition of this is to harden, to make callous, and to render insensitive. Their heart was not sensitive to what God was doing at this time. They missed it because they missed what he had just done. They had missed the loaves and the fish. They didn't understand what had happened. And I think in our lives, a lot of times we find ourselves in the same boat as the disciples. We see things, we see miracles, we see things happening, and then when something else happens, it says they were greatly amazed beyond measure. Like they weren't like, oh wow, that's kind of shocking. It said they were. Listen to these adjectives that we have here. We also have an adverb here. We have greatly. They were greatly amazed beyond measure. They're not just, wow, that's surprising. Greatly amazed beyond measure. And they had just watched 5 loaves and 2 fish feed 5,000 people. And so what we started talking about last week is this idea of hardness of heart and what it means to have a hard heart. And what hardness of heart is, and we're going to go into this, is relating more to the natural realm than to the supernatural realm, than to the things that God is doing. They had just seen this miracle. They go across in the sea, and you know what they were depending on that sea? They were depending on everything they knew as sailors. They were in that boat. They'd been on that water. They'd been on the Sea of Galilee. They knew the area. They knew what it took to get across to the other side. They knew about storms. They knew all those things. And everything they knew, everything they were depending on, was what was already up in here. Things that they had learned, things that they had done, things that they had done in the natural. Nowhere once do they consider the supernatural and the spiritual and what Jesus is doing. And lest you think this is the only time they're going to do it, keep going down to the next. We talked about this last week. Go down to Mark chapter 8. Mark 8:14. So Jesus, they're going to go, once again, Jesus likes to go to the other side. I guess it's a big thing for him. And he said in verse 13, he left them and getting in the boat again departed to the other side. He just left the Pharisees. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than one loaf on them with the boat. So they're sitting there thinking, we're about to get hungry, guys. You know, you need to have your, as my kids say and my nephew, snackities. You got to have your snackities with you. You'll be hungry. You got to have something. So they only have this one. So they said, what are we going to do? And Jesus says, he charged them, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, it's because we have no bread. But Jesus, being aware of this, so they're talking about not having bread, and Jesus says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. And they're like, oh, he's mad that we forgot the snacks, guys. He's like talking about bread. And it says, Jesus, being aware of this, said, why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? And how many baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said to him, 12. And also when I broke, we didn't even talk about this, he had also just done it again for 4,000. He had also broken the loaves and fed 4,000 just right before this. And when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said, 7. And he said to them, how is it that you do not understand? Keep going. Then he, okay, that's where I want to stop. He said, how is it that you don't understand? How is it that you've seen these miracles? Can you imagine? And I said to you last week, sometimes you tell your kids something. You say, this is what I want you to do. This is what I want to have happen. This is how we're going to act. And then they do something. And you're like, okay, guys, this is not what we do. This is what I want you to do. When you get up in the morning, I want you to get straight to your work. I want to get your math work done. I want this to happen. I want these things to go. And then again, they don't do it. And you're like to the point where you're like, how is it you're not understanding? How is it that you're not seeing what I'm trying to tell you to do? And that's what he's saying. How are you missing this? How are you missing? And this is even bigger than, I've told you to go do your schoolwork. I told you to get the house clean. He says, how are you missing the supernatural? How are you missing that the kingdom of heaven is not like this kingdom of earth? This kingdom of heaven is different. And he says to them, how are you not understanding? How are you not getting? You're seeing these miracles. You're seeing these things that are happening. And yet, here we are again, and I'm having to explain it to you again. That ought to give you a lot of patience when you're explaining to other people again and again. Because God's probably looking at you being like, darling, don't you just remember? Where I was just having to tell you something that I just had to tell you 5 times yesterday. Don't you remember? Don't you have some compassion? Because, I don't know about you, but God sometimes will have to tell me things. I'm a slow learner sometimes. He has to tell it to me again. And he has to tell it to me again. But he's telling them, he's like, this is, guys, this is big. We got to understand this. And we looked at, don't need to turn there, but we looked at John 6, verse 4, and it's one of these stories where he's feeding the 5,000, or feeding the thousands. And Philip comes to him and says, where shall we buy bread that these might all eat? And it says, but he said to Philip, where are we going to buy bread? He said to Philip, how are we going to feed all these people? And he said this to test him, for he knew exactly what he was going to do. Jesus already knew. He said he was giving Philip a chance to pass the test. He was giving Philip a chance to be like, oh, I know, pick me. I know what we're going to do. We're going to multiply the fish and the loaves. We're going to do this. I know what we're going to do. And I think as believers, Jesus is coming to us constantly. We're like, Jesus, help me out of this situation. Help me get victory here. And he's saying, Like, what are you going to do? You know, and what you need to be like, I know what we're going to do. I know. We're going to find the answer because you've already done it. We're going to find the healing. We're going to find the deliverance because it's already done. Because we've seen these miracles. Because we've seen what God has already done. And we spent a good time last time going through the children of Israel and talking about Pharaoh and Pharaoh hardening his heart, that was different because Pharaoh chose to harden his heart and refused to believe God till the end. God hardens it for him. But how even Pharaoh sees God and sees things and is still says, I'm going to stand up against God. I'm going to stand up against the Lord God Almighty. I'm going to be the one that takes him down. And we said even his own army came to him and said, Pharaoh, you're not going after these Israelites. And he's like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to take these people down. And you know the story. They all drowned in the Red Sea. But it's that idea somehow of hardening our heart, of becoming insensitive, of missing the things that are in front of us. And you know what? Lest you think, well, that's silly Pharaoh. My kids and I were listening to Exodus, and we were going through, and they were listening to him be delivered out of the Red Sea. And then as soon as they crossed, they're praising. They said Miriam does a dance. The children of Israel have this party. And then like the next verse, it says they decided they were thirsty. And they started, it would have been better if we had died in Egypt than you took us out here. And we listened to, I don't know what, 3 or 4 chapters, Kay? I can't even remember. And time after time, God would do these miracles for them. And they would praise the Lord. You know, the manna. Guys, manna. Okay, so they said, we don't have anything to eat. And God's like, excellent, I will take care of you. I will give you manna, and I will give you quail. So he gives them bread, which said was like, I can't even remember how they described it, like some type of a lacy. I'm really interested to know what manna looked like. Like this just really sweet, like soft. I don't even know. He's giving them this food. They didn't have to cook. They did not have to cook. Yes, hallelujah, what a miracle. All they had to do is go out there and gather it. And they had to gather, and that was funny too. He'd be like, everybody go out and gather, you know, the amount they need. And then like some people chose not to do it, and then there was no food. Or some people didn't, you know. Or when he told them gather enough so that you don't have to gather any on the Sabbath. Or no, he told them don't leave any leftovers. And if they left leftovers, they had worms and all the stuff was gross and disgusting. But yeah, I just laugh. But they would over and over and over again, the children of Israel see God's miracles and they're rejoicing and they're like, yes, look what you've done. And 2 seconds later, I wish we would have just died in Egypt. We at least had leeks and onions there. At least things were better when we were there. At least. And they forgot immediately. I mean, the miracle, can you think about the miracle of them walking out of Egypt? The plagues and the stuff that God did to deliver them and how far he took them. It said that they plundered Egypt when they left. They left with all of Egypt's riches. It said they left with everyone whole and healed. As a group, they went out healthy. They left Egypt in this victory with this great miraculous, I mean, can you imagine watching the Red Sea split? By my kid's favorite part, by the breath of his nostrils. Can you imagine God blowing his nose and watching, they love that part, blowing his nose and watching the sea split? And to go across and forget. And you're like, well, I wouldn't have forgotten. Yeah, you would have, because I have. I have forgotten. I have seen God do things. I have watched miracle after miracle. I've seen God show up. I've seen him deliver. I've been where, things are tight and he'll show up with money. And, the next time you're like, God, where are you? And that's what the disciples are doing here. They forget. They're in the midst of the storm. And instead of sitting there and saying, oh, the God that can multiply loaves and fish can stop a storm, guys. This is God. This is the stuff that he's done. And what we're going to talk about tonight is it's about the idea of what are you considering? And we started talking about this a little last week. Where are your thoughts? And what are you thinking about? The disciples' problem was they were thinking naturally. And unless you think, well, how dare they? That's how you think. You think naturally because you live in a natural world. You live in a world from the time you're little, people talk to you about what can you see? What can you hear? What can you touch? What can you taste? All those things. And you were trained at an early age to go by your senses. How do you feel today? We ask people, how are you feeling today? How are you doing? What do you see? Oh my gosh, look at the news report. Did you hear this? Did you see this? And we are trained to focus on those things, to focus on the natural, to focus on what's in front of us. And I'm going to talk about just kind of the idea of what does it mean to consider something else, to consider how can we go from considering the storm to considering the loaves and the fish. How do we do that? Just Proverbs, I'm just going to read it to you real quick just for the sake of time. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 20 through 22 says, "My son, give attention to my words. Incline your ear to my sayings. Do not let them depart from your eyes. Keep them in the midst of your heart, for they are life to those who find them and health to all their flesh." If you're looking at this word, to incline, it means to turn your ear or your heart toward. It conveys a sense of reaching out and making something accessible or available. So God said the first thing you have to do is give attention to his words. Because you're going to hear words all day long. Somebody or something is speaking to you all day long. You are hearing it from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep at night. You are hearing something speaking to you. And what you're hearing is going to be different for each of us. You might be hearing your own voice telling you, "You stupid idiot, you screwed up. How dare you having done that? Here you are struggling when you shouldn't be here." You might hear the news report. "Oh my gosh, eggs are like $1,000 a container. You're never going to eat eggs again. Be prepped, be prepared. Things are bad. Oh, the war, rumors of war." You're going to hear it from the time you wake up. You're going to hear your boss. You're going to hear your coworkers. "Oh, it's flu season. Guys, it's flu season. Everyone's getting the flu. Man, you're going to get the flu. Everyone has it. Wash your hands. Just pray for the best. Get some medicine. Be ready. You're going to get the flu. Oh, the stomach bug. It's coming. It's the time." I'm hearing this all the time. Be healthy. Wash your hands. Everybody take care of themselves. And you should wash your hands. It's just a good idea. Keep your fingers out of your mouth. Good idea. But you hear it. It's constant. It's right now all the time. It's the season. It's the season. It's the season. It's the season. And we're hearing it. And we're hearing it. And we're hearing it. And what happens is that we hear it so much that's what we start to consider. That's what we start to think about. That's what we start to put our focus on. Just whatever you give your attention to is going to be what you believe and what you follow. In Genesis, the story where the serpent comes to Eve, and he's talking to Eve, and he says to Eve, "Did God really say, what did God say? Did he say that you could eat from all the trees?" So he's got her he starts to approach this conversation. He brings it up to her. What did God really say? What did he say? And he starts to get her talking. And she's like, "Well, he said that we could do everything but eat this tree." And that Satan starts to talk to her. And in Genesis, I think it's 3:6, it says, Eve saw the tree and saw that it was good. So somewhere in there, she's talking, and all of a sudden she looks and she starts considering that tree. She starts to look. Yeah, see, there you go. She saw the tree, that it was good for food and that it was pleasant to the eye, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. And she took of its fruit and ate it. But where did it start? It started with Satan coming and saying, "Have you considered? Have you thought about this? Why? What's going on?" And he starts talking to her. And you know what she didn't say? "Hey, you know what? You're not God. Get out of here. I'm not talking to you." She started talking to him. She started listening to him. And then here, where you have the switch, it says she saw it. She saw that tree, that it was good for food. And she looked, and all of a sudden she's like, "Wow, you know what? He's right. That tree looks amazing. That fruit just looks really good. I really never thought about it, but now I really want it." You guys know what I'm talking about? You ever been there? You're not even thinking about something. Whatever your vice is. And, you're not even thinking about it. And someone's like, "Hey, have you considered?" I don't know what yours is. I like brownies personally. Somebody brings you some brownies. You're not even thinking about them. You're trying to eat healthy. You're trying to not eat any of that. And someone's like, "Hey, I made these brownies over here. Come look at them. They're really good. It's an amazing recipe." Now, if I don't want to eat brownies, what do I need to do? I need to not go over there and look at them. I need to be like, "No, thank you. No, thanks. I'm not eating brownies right now. Really appreciate it. I'm sure they're amazing. But I'm not even going to go over there." We were talking about in our Bible study how to avoid temptation. And best we could come up with is, if you know you're tempted with something, stay away. Do not allow it in your life. If there is something you do not want to be considering, don't let it happen. You know, if the idea of hearing about the economy crashing scares you, then guess what you shouldn't do? Listen to the news. If the idea of all the chickens dying in the world bothers you, you probably shouldn't look at the news report. If, I told you last week, plane crashes bother you, well, you ought to not read the details about a plane crash. Be smart. Don't do it. Don't consider it. Because here we have Eve, and she's not even thinking about this tree. It's not even bothering her. She's going about her business, not even thinking. And Satan brings her attention to it. And he tells her, consider it. And you know what she does? She considers it. She considers it. She starts to sit and she starts to think about it. And it doesn't tell us how long this is, but there's a little bit of description. It's good, it's pleasant, desirable. And she takes it and she eats it. But I don't think that just happened in an instant. I think there was some time, some thought process. You ever have a thought and it comes up here? And it's nothing when it's first here, but it's when you start to stop and consider it and think about it and go over it in your mind and, oh, yeah, okay. And you start to think about it. You start to think about those brownies and you're like, man, they really would be really delicious. And you know what? They're homemade, so they're better. They're better than the box stuff. It'd be better for me. And you start to think about how tasty they were. And you start to think, well, you know what? I was really good all week. I was eating my vegetables and my protein, and I was really good. And so I start to consider that brownie. And you know what's going to happen is I'm going to probably go over there and eat not just one, but I'll probably eat 2 or 3, or however many you can take. You can't take that many brownies, you'd get sick. At least I can't. But you consider. It's that considering. It's that thinking about it. It's that, the disciples, it said the disciples hadn't understood and they didn't consider the loaves and fish. Well, they were considering something. What they were considering was the fact that they were in the middle of that sea with a storm raging around them, and they were also considering ghosts. All right? They were considering ghosts. They were. They see someone walking, they've seen a massive amount of miracles, and they see someone walking on the water, and they think ghost. So obviously, they had been considering ghosts. I'm not sure that's the first thing I would have thought about when someone walked on the water. I don't know what I would have thought, but clearly that's what they had been considering. Because when they see him, they're like, it's a ghost. So they considered it. They were considering. You were always considering something. You're considering the weather, the news, your body, if you're sick. And this is what I was talking about last week. A lot of times when you're sick, what do? You start considering your symptoms. You start considering, all right, well, I'm going to take inventory. All right, my head hurts, my neck hurts, my back hurts, my body hurts. Oh my gosh, everything hurts. It's, you start to consider. And the more you start to think about it, the more you start to think about, the pain and how you feel. And, there are times when, as a girl, there's certain things that come. And I won't be thinking anything about it. I won't be graphic. I won't be thinking anything about it. And all of a sudden, I'm like, oh, okay. And you know what always happens? I start to consider, oh my gosh, the pain. And I start to consider it. But until that moment, you following me what I'm saying? Until that moment when I started considering it, I didn't feel anything. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying there's not real symptoms. Sometimes you wake up, and I had this the other day. I woke up, my throat was a little scratchy. I wasn't really thinking about it. I kept thinking, I need a drink. I just need to get something to drink. And that's what I was thinking about. And all of a sudden, I was like, oh, my throat's sore. And I started to consider it. I started to think about it. I started to think about how it felt. I started thinking about, oh, I need to make sure that I, start gargling some water. And I considered. And I did tell you how the Lord stopped me and told me not to consider. I told you about my kids and the flu last week, that I was not going to consider the symptoms that I'd seen other people have. But there's that thought that we all have. Satan is constantly coming, trying to have us consider the natural world. Because this is how he operates. Satan operates out here. He operates in the natural. What he can get you in is, can you see it? Can you hear it? Can you smell it? Can you taste? Are there things that you can connect into the natural world? And he's constantly trying to have us consider and put our thoughts onto, what's around us, what's going on, what's happening. And one of the things I think we have to be really careful with is what goes on up here. What are we thinking about? Andrew Womack said something, and I wrote it down, and I loved it. He said, your memory is linked to your heart. What your heart is sensitive to, you will remember. Wherever you are, he was talking about, he goes, yeah, some people will tell me, I don't know how, Andrew, you memorize all these Bible verses and how you have all the Bible memorized. And he says to him, well, can you tell me about, last year's Super Bowl? And they're like, the Chiefs. I don't know. Chiefs won, I think. The Chiefs won. I don't care about football, so it's not something I consider. They won, and this was the quarterback, and these were the stats, and it went into, whatever. And he said, why is it that they can remember that? They can remember it because they've considered it, and their heart is sensitive to it. And it's easy for them to pick it up. It's easy for them to, if you don't care about something, somebody tells you something like, I'm not going to say I don't care, but sometimes when Tom talks to me about Dominion, he'll tell me about all these fascinating transformers and KB something lines, and I am trying to be a dutiful wife, and I listen, and I care. I'm not saying I don't care, but because my heart's not sensitive to it, I don't remember it. Like, he'll tell me things, and I'll be like, that's great. And sometimes I'll say, hey, remember how you were telling me about that thing you guys were working on? How'd that go? And he's like, what are you talking about? I was like, well, remember, and then I have to get into details. Remember when we were walking the dogs and it was raining and this, and you were telling me about how so-and-so said such and such? How'd that project go? Because my heart is not considering, I am not considering transformers and engineering terms. I'm just not. See how bad I am about this already. I'm not considering it. Sometimes when my kids tell me about something, they'll be really excited, and they'll tell me about something. They'll tell me about they watch this Minnie Mouse cartoon with their grandmother, and they'll tell me about it, and they'll be giggling so hard, and they'll be so excited. But I'm not really considering it, so sometimes when I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, I have no idea what you just talked about, because I wasn't considering it. But the point is, whatever you can consider, whatever you think about, is what's going to go into your heart. Whatever your heart is sensitive to, you're going to remember. That's what's going to come out. That's what's going to, I'm almost out of time. That is what's going to be your focus. And as believers, our hearts need to be considering the Lord Jesus Christ at all times. We need to be focused on Him, focused on His Word, and what He said. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to read you this. John 10 says that, John 10:4, that He brings out His own sheep, He goes before them, and the sheep follow Him, for they know His voice. Yet they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of a stranger. Jesus said, my sheep know my voice. They know me. They know who I'm talking to. They know that I'm calling them. And as believers, we have to keep considering His voice. What is He saying? What is Jesus saying? What is He, it says that we won't follow the voice of a stranger. And there are constant voices coming at you all the time, telling you, this is how you should think. This is how you should believe. Consider this. Consider that. I love that word consider. It's just really struck me, is that it's an idea of, what do you sit there and stop and say, I think about this for a minute. What about this? What about that? What about the loaves and the fish? What about the miracles? What you should be thinking about is, you sit and think, all right, well, I'm dealing with the flu. What should I be considering? Well, you need to go in here and find a scripture and consider that Jesus, the Son of God, God came as flesh and dwelt among us, that He took it on His body. You need to consider that. And I got a lot more scriptures to go into what the Bible tells us to consider, but I guess that will have to be next week. But we need to be deciding, what are we looking at? What are we putting our thoughts on? What are we thinking about? Where is our heart at? What are the things that we are stopping to think about? Because every day you are presented, just like Eve, with this, did God really say? Does this really, he just doesn't want this. Did God really say that by His stripes you could be made whole? Did God really say with a long life He can satisfy you? Did God really say that He'll meet all your needs according to His riches and glory? Did God really say that you could speak to a storm and it could calm down? Did God really say? And you have to stop and decide, what am I going to consider? Am I going to stop and consider the circumstances, consider the natural, consider what's right in front of me? Because that's what most of us do. Most of us, if we're really honest, that's what we do. When something happens, when we have a relationship that's tough, when we have something that's going on, we spend a lot of time considering it. Oh, I got to figure out how to fix this. I got to figure out how to make this right. I got to figure out how to get my kids to behave. I got to figure out how to get my marriage fixed. I got to figure out how to, take care of this. How am I going to make ends meet? What am I going to do? And we consider. We consider the things in front of us instead of considering those loaves and fish. Instead of looking and thinking, man, what miracles has God done? What has he done in my life? There's a reason that in the Old Testament, and I'm wrapping up with this, and the reason in the Old Testament that he had them make memorials, he had them set up stones and things, he said, don't forget. He also says, teach it to your children so they can teach it to their children. You want a living testimony. You want to write it down. You want to remember the things that God has done. And the reason he tells us to memorialize it is because we forget. If we don't consider it, we will forget it. If you have brownies on your counter, and I'm going to keep coming back to this. One time I had some cookies, and I wanted to have them later, but there are 2 people in my house that eat a lot of cookies if they're on the counter. One probably more than others, and I didn't want him to have all the cookies because he'll eat like 6 in a row. And I decided I was going to hide them so that I could eat them later because I really wanted these cookies. And I took them and I put them in the pantry and I kind of tucked them behind stuff so that some random person in my house couldn't find them. But you know what happened after a while? I forgot they were there. I did not consider them. The night happened. I forgot I'd stuck them there. Day went by. I probably remembered the next day, oh yeah, I have those cookies there. I'm going to go pull them out. And not that I didn't want to share. I just want to make sure I had some. And one day I walk in there and I'm moving something and I'm like, oh my gosh. These cookies have been in here for, I don't know, it was like a month. I had not considered them. I had tucked them back behind stuff, forgotten completely about them. Just totally forgot them. And how did I forget about them? I took them away from my eyes so that I couldn't consider it anymore. So I wasn't thinking about it. And it wasn't intentional on my part. But I think that's a natural example that shows you how the spiritual could work. If there's something that you're struggling with, put it to the side and say, I'm not going to think about this. I'm not going to go there. I'm going to think about this instead. And you do have to replace. In the spirit world, you can't just remove one thing and leave it. You have to fill it in with something. You have to, if you try to get rid of worry, you can't just say, oh, I'm not going to worry anymore. I'm not going to worry anymore. I'm not going to worry anymore. You know what you're going to do? Worry. Because all you're saying is, I'm not going to worry. 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 And I'm worrying still. The way to stop worrying is to stop considering whatever it is and say, you know what, I'm not going to do that. Kenneth Hagin always said, you can't stop the birds from flying over your head. Those thoughts, those worries, those fears are flying constantly, but you can stop them from building a nest in your hair. You can stop that thought from becoming something that you consider. When you see those brownies, you can say, I'm just not even going to think about them anymore. I'm going to put them to the side. I'm going to move them over here, and I'm not going to be worried by them. I'm just going to go on about my life. When I think about whatever this is, I'm going to say, you know what? It's not my problem. It's God's problem. God promised that he's going to meet all my needs according to his riches and glory. So this bill, I'm not even going to worry about. I'm going to put it over here in the drawer, and I'm going to say, God, you got this. It's not my problem. I'm not going to think about this right now. I'm going to consider what your word says instead. All right, I know I'm out of time, so I'm just going to pray, and we'll have to continue this another time. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the ability to consider what you've done, that you've given us powerful tools, that you've given us a memory, that you've given us the ability to focus in on something and to think about it and to put our attention there. And Father, help us to put our attention in the right spots. All day long, there's demands on our time and our energy, on our brain space and the things that we think about. And that we would start considering you, considering your word, considering your miracles and what you've already done. And that when we're considering other things, that you'll just stop us. And that you'll remind us of who you are and what you've done, and that we will turn our eyes towards you, and that we'll look towards your face and the things that you've done. And I just thank you, Lord, for that. I thank you that we are going to consider your word before anything else. We're going to consider your ways. The kingdom of heaven is going to be where our focus and consideration is in this week. And I thank you, Lord, for that. I just thank you for this time together. I just ask you to bless the fellowship and bless the food. In Jesus'